Good evening, and welcome to Talk the Walk. I'm Azam Khan. All eyes were on China earlier this week as the 20th Party Congress kicked off, where major plans were announced and a future trajectory was conveyed. Yet much of Western mainstream media was quick to paint a somber picture of what was conveyed. This can be expected, as China is not only becoming the most important voice in international affairs on every level, but doing so with its own style and socio-cultural nuances, from the Belt and Road to the Global Development Initiative. Just how it took time for the European powers to adapt to the American voice after the Second World War, so too the world needs to continue to understand and work with China's style and nuances, and how China tells its own story to the world across different cultural boundaries and political rivalries is just as important. Joining us tonight to explore the topic is Dr. Daniel Vukovich, Associate Professor at HKU, author and scholar on Chinese cultural studies. Thank you for taking the time to speak with me, Dr. Vukovich.
Oh, thank you. It's nice to be here.
Professor, I want to jump right into it with a story that happened earlier this week. You might have seen with two giant pandas from China that landed in Qatar ahead of the World Cup event as part of China's Panda diplomacy. And this is a unique and receptive example of soft power. And although the Chinese football team won't be competing, they helped to build a lot of the infrastructure for the World Cup event. In your opinion, do you think this is the prime example of Chinese soft power?
Yeah, it's certainly a kind of classic example, the pandas in particular. Right. So that I think that works. People like to see the pandas.
Right.
And as you know, when it's building the infrastructure and helping Qatar have and host these games, therefore, that's a definite example of its soft power. That concept is not one I'm totally happy with, but it's probably here to stay. The sense that it's like a power play necessarily, right? Like almost that there's something manipulative or something like that to it. And if certainly, China's trying to make friends, and this is exercising diplomacy and things like that. But it's a good example, I think, of what it's done elsewhere in other places, in Africa, even Sri Lanka. China often gets a lot of bad press around this kind of whatever they call it, debt diplomacy, or it's like sneakily being imperialistic or something like that. And of course, sometimes projects fail, but more often than not, they also work well, right? And when it does this kind of business, basically fair trade, or whatever you want to call it, free and fair trade, rules-based kind of stuff like that, then it certainly has, I think, a positive effect on its image in other places around the world, right? And it's got a track record of that. And I think it will, continue to do that because other governments, other economies like this or can benefit from it. So it's been successful on many occasions in doing this kind of, what they like to call win-win or kind of mutually beneficial trade or kind of economic engagements without laying down, like as the World Bank and IMF do, or at least used to do, very strict rules for how they should structure their economy, or they're not going to give loans or this and that kind of stuff, right? China's not engaged in that. And I think that's been both to its credit and beneficial to other places.
Right, yeah, I brought up that example of the two pandas because you have the development of the infrastructure for the World Cup, and that's usually what people associate with China's soft power, which is purely its economic development. And then you have the pandas, which is a staple of China and pretty much the extent of the understanding of China by the rest of the world.
Yeah, absolutely.
As a university professor for many years, both in Hong Kong and the Chinese mainland, you've obviously experienced and know the reality of Chinese source scholars and sources in academia. But I was wondering how you would compare that to Chinese-sourced voices in international affairs in mainstream media, and is there any similarity that can be drawn between the two?
Well, there is kind of a problem here, isn't there? And I mean, I've written about this. Other people have talked about it too, I think, particularly on the mainland. But and there's an overlap often between some of the China academic discourse in political science or in other kind of fields with the media spheres, right? Often people talk in both realms or something like that. But anyway, so it's striking, isn't it, that you will often not see a mainland Chinese scholar or expert or intellectual, or a mainland-based one from wherever, on the kind of Western media sites or some of the online commentariat places, right? There will be Chinese people there of Chinese ethnicity or ancestry, but are either from a Western country or reside in a Western country for years and years and years, so that they kind of serve as these kind of representative Chinese people or Chinese experts, and yet they're not based in the mainland, right? So in other words, you don't often find a mainland-based person on these shows or in these reports, et cetera. And the question is, well, why is that? And it's because in many cases, not all, but in many cases, these folks would diverge from the kind of expected Western kind of liberal narrative or viewpoints, right? They're going to tend to be less critical of the party system or the party state and things like that, right? They'll have different views on maybe the lockdown policies or whatever's happening in Xinjiang or in Hong Kong or somewhere else or something around the world, right? And the issue there is that they're not included, I think, more or less for that reason, or in other words, they're kind of dismissed for being, essentially agents of the state, right? Or brainwashed, or nationalistic, or patriotic, or something like that, right? And the flip side of that, of course, is that the Western-based intellectual or commentator doesn't get the same treatment, right? They're seen as free. So there is this kind of almost structural problem around that, where you just don't have that interlocutor for a real dialogue with someone from the mainland, right? Even if you would know ahead of time that they're going to disagree with you, why not have them anyway, right? Would be what I say, right? So it's often that kind of debate is just missing, and it ends up being an echo chamber, basically, one way or the other. Or, you'll see people on where you might see the mainland-based intellectual or scholar or something like that, would be maybe on Russian media. And of course, especially on China's own media, right? And then those sites in turn can end up being blocked in the United States or elsewhere as being state-based and therefore suspicious or something like that, right? So there's definitely this kind of, geopolitical dynamic of like hostility between states that really maps onto some of this kind of analytical and media commentary and reportage.
Right. This follows up from what you were just saying. That would you say that there's a strong tendency for mainstream media to look at the Chinese way of doing things and projecting this Western democratic lens, so to speak?
Yeah, definitely. There's and there's a really long history of this, right? It's something that's really intensified in the last 10 years or so, right? And the global pandemic really fed this, right? It fed a lot of xenophobia, right? So that, of course, these are just polls. You have to take them for whatever they're worth. But I think you've seen, it's been all over the media, like, people in Australia, people in the United States, to a lesser extent in Europe. But everyone's concerned with China invading them or going to war with them or something like that, right? And there's no doubt that China has been pushing back in its rhetoric and discourse against what it takes to be kind of either Western imperialism or just arrogance or chauvinism or rudeness or whatever, right? But it's not going to invade anywhere, right? There really is what I've called, other people have called, a kind of political Orientalism at work, right?
Right.
In other words, precisely around this question of the perceived lack of a kind of Western liberal kind of normative political system in China, that it's still some form of a kind of despotic or dictatorial or totalitarian system in total, right?
Right.
And that has to be opposed by them, because that notion of the West kind of embodying or even giving to the world this kind of liberal democracy and freedom and that kind of stuff is so important to what we can call like the identity or the self-understanding of the West and its broad political, intellectual kind of culture, right? That it's extremely hard for it to not see China in particular, because it's powerful now, other parts of the world that are not that, as antagonists and as problems for them in some way.
Right. You mentioned the increase of research. Research shows the increase of this fear from the local population, specifically in the United States. There's an increase of fear of military threat, particularly in the last several years, and I think that runs parallel with the dial-up of particular rhetoric from the mainstream media against China over certain geopolitical tensions and rivalries, of course. So how does China reconcile or balance that, like being able to convey its soft power, but against this sort of headwind?
Well, this is the thing with soft power. And when it comes to certain questions that tend to touch on more "quote unquote" hard power around like perceived military threats or invasions or perceived wars, something like that, it's extremely difficult to, I think, make any headway on that, right? And there's a way in which some of the economic stuff can become a form of economic conflicts, competition, can come not as soft power, which is what it should be, but as hard power, like really confrontational and things like that. But how can it make headways into that? In some ways, it might be like Mission Impossible.
How to go, yeah,
right?
how to work
it could
with
be
it.
like a movie like that, right?
Yeah, how to work against that headway. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think one thing to do would be nice to just say, okay, let's just stop. Let's not care about soft power in this way, right? What if we're less concerned with the West and its argument or beef with us, and we're just kind of do our own thing, right? That we're going to continue doing, kind of global trade and exchanges, right? If and when Chinese economy opens up, it'll have more exchanges through its borders, right? And then let that kind of take care of itself. Because I think one of the problems vis-a-vis the West and China is that China's caught up in a kind of competition or kind of dialectic with its own kind of identity as a state or as a nation state or national culture with the United States and West in particular.
Professor,
right?
I'll have to stop you there for 1 minute.
Yeah.
As we take a quick break.
Sure.
Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with Dr. Vukovich, Associate Professor at HKU. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Talk the Walk with me. I'm Azam Khan. For those of you who are just tuning in, I'm speaking with HKU Associate Professor, Dr. Daniel Vukovich. Professor, when you look at China's growing partnership with Africa, and a recent survey from a South African foundation showed the increase in popularity and China's positive impact amongst the survey of African youth in the continent. What are some ways China can evolve its own understanding of its global outreach through the continent?
Yeah, I think that's a good example. I mean, to go back to what we were kind of discussing earlier, like the soft power game vis-a-vis kind of Western kind of liberal discourse, democratic political discourse. I think China, so if that game is kind of rigged or fixed, or it's not a very fair game, basically, then play a different game or play that with other people. And so when it gets to the case of Africa or other places in Asia, I think China's had more success and could continue to have more success, partly because these kind of non-Western essentialize them. They're all very different. But just the fact that they're also different from the West, I think, is what makes them more appreciative or able to appreciate or see China a little bit differently and more positively, because they're not hung up on the same question of superiority or the same competition geopolitically, right? So I think
Right.
that
And it also has a
it
history that the
can
continent has.
continue
Sure,
to
just to
do
follow.
what it's kind of already doing.
Yeah, I think the
Yeah,
continent
go
also
ahead.
has
Sorry.
the continent also has a history. It's of coming out of the post-colonial sort of destruction from certain Western powers, and so that sort of leaves it's a very unique landscape when you combine that with China's just investment and development. Second to none by far. So it's a very unique.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, the countries of Africa, other countries in Asia or in South America, they don't need to be told that colonialism and imperialism was a problem and that it comes with certain ideological baggage from the West, even today, right? That it still matters at some level, right? And so they can understand that China is dealing with perhaps a similar problem of a certain kind of arrogance or a certain kind of putative universalism from the West that they already know because they've had to deal with it or get to terms with it themselves.
Right. So, in Europe, do you have any opinions on how China specifically can enhance its global outreach? There's been recently a push by the center government with a 20-point plan to sort of enhance its cultural trade and cultural imports, things like film and the arts, and by enhancing that, it'll help create this exchange. But is there anything else that you see just culturally that China could focus on to help enhance its outreach?
I think those things are all important, and this is something that we have to remember. This is the kind of stuff that takes a long time to change, right? You're talking about ways people can see each other, discursively, et cetera. That takes a long time to evolve. But I think that, and others of us have said this before in meetings in China and things like that too, to get better at soft power means to tell better stories about yourself, where you've been and where you're going. So you need to keep spinning this and keep working on this. How do we tell the story of how we got here, China, its rise, or its future, or what its problems are? Because you have to be also, legitimate or authentic about admitting to those as well, right? So that would be it, right? So this is actually it might sound small, but I think it's a very important point. The better quality story you can tell, right? So it needs to be something not just about economics or something like that, but this is who we are, or who gets to represent and what gets to represent China and how it sees the world and this kind of thing, right? So
Right.
it does need to keep working at that, refining that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because this is something that Hong Kong as well is sort of trying to focus on. It's a big part of Chief Executive John Lee's new push is for Hong Kong to tell its story. He's even set up a task force. He said he's literally set up a task force to, help with this particular agenda. So when you see both, we're talking about this on a national level with China, but also with the Hong Kong's push and drive to retell its story. Both have faced a very similar sort of reaction from the West and Western media in the last several years, almost painting it and disparaging it. So how do you see that sort of parallel journey now that both regions are taking, or the country and the city is taking?
Well, that's an interesting way to put it. I think it is a parallel journey now, and I think that John Lee is quite correct to say that this is an important thing for Hong Kong to do, and we need to get better at telling the story of Hong Kong, or our story, or who we are. It could kind of get beyond cliches of like Asia's global city or gateway to China or something like that, right? Because if Hong Kong and China are now more parallel, then the gate isn't the only story, or the only way to kind of put that. So how will it do that? I mean, you're still going to have that pushback from other sources, right? I think that what you can do is you try to tell a good story, right? Like, so who will get to represent Hong Kong now in this kind of second handover era and process, right? What is that going to be about? How will we benefit from not just an economic relation with China, but a more broadly cultural, social one, right?
Right.
And the more clear you can be, and the more concrete about what our story is and what the benefits are, future, the better off you're going to be, because then they meaning your adversaries, it will be harder for them to misrepresent you, or to be more obvious that that's what they're doing, you know?
Right.
And then partly, like I said before, you just gotta you gotta let go at one level. You're not gonna be able to convince some audiences and people of anything. So you gotta kind of go your own way and do it because you want to do it. I want to tell this story about Hong Kong.
So, Professor, would you say that the ASEAN region, now that it's become the largest trading partner recently of China, would you say that's probably the most important region now where China has to convey its global outreach and its soft power? Obviously, the region already has a cultural and historical ties to the Chinese culture, and it has large Chinese diaspora and what have you, compared to other parts of the world. So would you say that's a particularly important focus for its soft power to be enhanced in the coming years?
Yeah, I think so. I think this is a really even kind of exciting area to think about this question, right? China's had a very rich, but in the 20th century, very turbulent relation with 19th to 20th century with Europe and the West being the kind of hegemon, even with Japan, which China has such close relations and affiliations with, et cetera. That was obviously such a fraught situation, right? But Southeast Asia represents also a very long-standing history, as you noted, the large Chinese diaspora. There are many trade relations and things over the centuries, and yet it's kind of been underexplored, and it has a chance to kind of begin again, basically, right? Kind of begin fresh, hopefully with less baggage connected to wars and imperialism that were there in the past. So I think China's relationship with, Southeast Asia is going to be a really exciting and kind of interesting thing to see in the coming years. Yeah, for sure. And I think, like I said, like it's again, the trade, right? But not just the trade. I think that China can find a kind of receptive audience to its differences from the West and its kind of contemporary, kind of Asian condition.
Dr. Vukovich, thank you for taking the time to speak with me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. Anytime.
Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on Talk the Walk. Good night.